let's talk about the fear of loss. The fear of loss is an important aspect of behavioral economics, so there's a lot of research in that area of study. I think it's something deeply biological. People out in the caves, if you had stuff, you probably lived to pass those genes on. And whether that's social status, if you have social status, or you have options, or you have literal stuff, all of these things that you own, you want to keep, you want to hold on to. And so we have an inherent fear of loss, fear of losing stuff, fear of, again, relationships, opportunities, physical objects, social standing. The flip side of that is anticipation of gain. We are very excited and look forward to gaining all of those things. Now, the way that it spills out in interesting cognitive biases or weird human quirks that we, like to study. So some of the ways, that this kind of peters out is regret aversion. So, for example, we really dislike the feeling of regret. If someone makes a mistake and it cost them stuff, in the future they're going to be scared of making a similar mistake. Similarly, people really dislike risk. What's really interesting is there's a famous, and I go through this in the full course, but there's a famous experiment with an urn, and one of the urns has 50-50 odds, and if you pull a red ball out, you win. If you pull a yellow ball out, you lose, and it's 50-50 in one urn. And in the other urn, it's unknown odds. So maybe there are no yellow balls, maybe there's no red balls, right? So you are guaranteed to win, you're guaranteed to lose, or maybe it's 50-50 or some other combination. People really prefer the urn with 50-50 odds. They much prefer odds that are known. And they will even take less than 50-50 odds. They'll take a disadvantage to stick with odds they know than to maybe be forced to have odds that are really against them. It's just one of the ways that we really dislike fear of loss. We dislike risk. We dislike uncertainty. We dislike ambiguity. We just want to know what we're facing, know what we can sort of fit in. And one last quick part about the fear of loss. I mentioned social standing earlier, and it's important to talk about FOMO. That's a whole branch of research about fear of loss when it comes to social standing. So FOMO, it means fear of missing out. And with all the social media we have, for example, there's a correlation between people who are experiencing a lot of FOMO or fear of missing out, sort of that social anxiety, and people who use more social media. There's a correlation between those two, and I don't think that's surprising. Again, correlation does not mean causation, but there's certainly maybe a negative impact on how much people are around. They feel like they're around people all the time through social media, through Instagram, through Twitter, or whatever the hot new social media trend is, but you're not. And so you'd always feel, even if it's unconscious, like you're behind, like you're missing out, like you're losing those social standing, social connection that we all crave. So this is just some of the ways, and again, I talk about it in much, much more detail, but it's just some of the ways that this idea of fear of loss, this big concept that we are scared to lose, impacts so many aspects of our daily life. So that's the big concept, the big idea of fear of loss, or its flip, anticipation of gain. I think ethics is really, really important when you start talking about behavioral science, and I have a whole certificate on ethics. I think it's that important. I think I'm uniquely positioned to talk about it because I'm both a behavioral economist and an attorney. I'm a licensed attorney in the state of Illinois. So when it comes to the idea of nudges, that has become a hot topic, a hot buzzword. And I just want to say, I think people are using the word wrong. You can go read the original interpretation of the word nudge by Dr. Richard Thaler, who literally wrote the book on it called Nudge back in 2008. And the way he describes things as, quote, I view nudging as similar to GPS. When people use GPS, they input their own desired destination and are free to override the app's directions, but they get lost less often. That will also be true of well-designed nudges. They will help people achieve their own goals. Nudges are supposed to be small, easy to avoid, kind of nudges in the right direction, but people use them more broadly for what I would consider more extreme types of behavior change. So the way I break down this is I have created a spectrum of behavior change. So it starts with nudges, it moves to mandates, then it moves to coercions, and then it moves to manipulations. The way I break it down is nudges are, again, they're cheap and easy to avoid. It's a behavior change design that helps people go where they already want to go. So let's say that you're trying to buy cereal and you don't know whether to get Honey Nut Cheerios or Raisin Bran. You want cereal already, and maybe a nudge is like, hey, you should get the Raisin Brans, right? So we're nudging you in a direction, but you already wanted Raisin Bran anyways, kinda. You just didn't, you weren't quite sure. Next is a mandate. Mandates generally have a negative connotation, but they don't have to be negative. Mandates are basically all laws and rules. So think of the law and rule against drunk driving, where you get people will pull over, or there's checkpoints, or that's kind of a mandate. It's more than a nudge, but it's for the good of society. Or the NFL helmet to helmet contact rule, because we don't want people getting blows to the head. So there are these rules with harsh punishments that sort of mandate how the game is going to be played. People don't like them. That's not how they were brought up to play the game. It's not a nudge. It's more significant than a nudge, but it's not necessarily unethical or bad. So mandates are fine, but it's a more intense type of behavior change. Next up is coercion. I like to use the example of Apple getting rid of their headphone jack on their phones. So that coercion is a forced behavior change. At least in the helmet-to-helmet rule, like, you could do it, right? Like, if you really wanted to hit someone helmet to helmet, you could do it. There's going to be, or if you wanted to drive drunk, you could do it. There may be punishments. There may be, you may have to pay a price for your actions, but at least you do have the option. You really do. A coercion is you don't have options, okay? If you want to use headphones with an iPhone, you do not have the option to use wired headphones anymore. They got rid of the jack, okay? It is not even an option for you anymore. You're doing it this way. If you'd like to use headphones, you're using wireless headphones. So that is a coercion behavior change. And I like to use that example because it's not really ethical or unethical. It just kind of is. We are forcing the behavior change. And in this case, it's because we're Apple and we're visionaries and this is the future. And, in some ways, people sort of accept that. But it really is forced behavior change because there is no other option. And finally, the last part on the spectrum of behavior change is manipulation. This is generally unethical. Manipulation behavior change kind of works by changing the facts and reality of people to make them feel like there's only one correct choice. Again, these are usually unethical. The classic example is like a cult leader, where you feel like they're their only family. You can't leave because they control all your money and how you move around. And of course, the world's going to end next week, so you better stick with the call. I mean, so you're manipulating and twisting the way people are seeing the world to get that behavior change. A lot of scam artists, gaslighting, a lot of that's what I would call manipulation. And that's generally pretty unethical. So this is just this idea that it's not all a nudge. A lot of companies say, oh yeah, we're into nudges, and you're doing coercion, you're doing maybe not manipulation, you're doing mandates. And so just to think about these concepts broadly. In the full course, I go into much more detail about these ideas of nudging and how that fits and behavior change and sort of a framework of how to think about all this. Another concept I want to talk about is this idea of choice architecture. And much like a regular architect that's designing a building, a choice architect is designing the choices now that people experience. Now, I always like to say that there's always a choice architecture, but have you designed yours? And most people haven't. They just kind of put the options of the plans on their website. But to think about things like an economist, especially a behavioral economist, and to say, hey, these are choices. Let's think about the real choices and options that people are experiencing. It's a user-centered, user-first perspective. And we're going to have a different way of looking at the world. And maybe we're going to design the choices in a way that kind of funnels people towards this direction. So that's just some of the big research. In general, look, nudges work. Behavior change, the spectrum of behavior change, it works. It really does. And there's all sorts of strategies like partitioning and group framing and decoys. There's a whole world of knowledge again that I explore in the full course. But just thinking about the idea that we're walking around experiencing decision trees, that there's this spectrum of behavior change that you can choose. Okay, hey, do we want to be the company that is nudging people, or do we want to be the company that's mandating people, or are we manipulating people for our own profit? Just thinking about these sort of issues, I think, is really important and is really unique and very powerful. And of course, there's all the research that then goes behind it or with it. So that's the big concept of what a nudge is, how to think about these topics and issues. And I do hope that you think about these holistically in your own organization, because again, I started this section and I'll end it with saying ethics is actually really important. And I do think we should be thinking about these things in a larger, more coherent, more advanced perspective when it comes to behavior change. We created an entire process for behavior change called the behavioral design process. It's a step-by-step process to get you to have good outcomes when it goes to changing people's behavior. Now, we don't have time in this short course to go through the entire process, and I will leave that to the full course later. However, I did just want to talk about some high-level things about it because you might find it useful. And just the idea of thinking about having a process for designing behavior change is very different than what people, I think, generally consider. Now, why use a process? What's the point? Well, there are good reasons to use a process, and when people use a process, a couple things happen. First, you're much less likely to have your own cognitive biases or the organization's cognitive biases get in the way of your final design. And secondly, and make sure you're not missing any steps. So, and between both of those things, you probably will end up with better results. That's why you use any type of process, whether it's an agile process or a user-centered design process or a behavioral design process. There are 5 steps in the process that we put together. Describe the situation, decide on an action list, design the behavioral solutions, test, prototype, and iterate, and finally implement, measure, and refine. And the interesting thing is that, most of the stuff that we talk about when I talk about the behavioral design model, the behavioral design process, is the first 2 parts, because figuring out exactly the true facts, agreeing on potential solutions, getting everyone on the same page, and then deciding what specific action can we do to change behavior, that's really where the meat of it is. And then putting that into your end products and services, that's going to change so much on how you guys do design, how you do development. And it's, again, because of the variation, we focus, on the first parts. But there is, especially in the corporate world, there's a lot of corporate red tape, a lot of corporate BS, and a lot of mismatching priorities that get in the way of everyone in an organization saying, these are the outcomes we want. And these are the true outcomes we want, not the corporate BS outcomes. Like, maybe the outcome is we want to make as much money as possible. Usually that's not on the sort of HR manifesto of like values of the company, but then when you actually get to designing these solutions, the company is always picking the ones that make money. So like, what really are they? Just being honest and realistic, you're going to get better solutions, better outcomes. So this is just a cool little idea. Think about your behavioral design. If you're interested in maybe trying a process to help you get better results, try the behavioral design process. You've reached the end of Behavioral Economics Fundamentals. My name is Guthrie. Again, I hope you really enjoyed this short course in behavioral economics and the big picture, broad concepts and topics that I talked about. This was really hard for me to make because I could talk about any of these concepts for hours. I could do an hour about the research about the one little thing and the tiny just little part that I just had to gloss over in 5 seconds during this course. there's such an amazing breadth and depth of knowledge here that I really encourage you to explore. If you liked it, again, I have an entire certificate where I go into these in much more detail, these concepts and topics, and the research, which is maybe the most important part. But I'd also encourage you, I have a book, I love you to read this book. It's about human decision-making and behavioral economics. I also have a certificate in ethics that I think is really important. I mentioned how important ethics was, but I do believe I am well qualified to talk about it, both because I'm a licensed attorney in the state of Illinois and a behavioral economist. So it's not just theoretical ethics, but I like to talk about applied ethics. Ethics as applied to the real situations, the companies in the world, the situations we find ourselves in. That sort of applied ethics, I think, is really important. So if you're interested in any of this stuff, feel free to check out these things. I am really passionate about this field and this topic. I'm so happy that it's becoming popular and that sort of hitting the mainstream. And again, I mean, it's sort of the field I'm in, so of course I'm very biased in that way. But I'm still really glad because these concepts, I think, are so important and so valuable, but they're complicated. And so they haven't really hit the mainstream as fast as other topics that are maybe a little easier to grasp, but I think they're so powerful. So I hope you enjoyed Behavioral Economics Fundamentals. I know I had a tough time, but a fun time teaching it, and I hope you have a great rest of your week. Thank you.